No, gracias. No voy a, nuevamente no voy a hablar mucho. Quería decirles simplemente cómo va a ser la dinámica de la conferencia. Generalmente las conferencias en Estados Unidos, la de Rahul, son conferencias más reducidas. En Estados Unidos, cualquier conferencia que dure más de 45 minutos es una aberración, pero esta vez Rahul ha viajado conmigo y un grupo de arquitectos. Hemos ido a Cusco, viaje típico, y ha estado tan digamos, agradablemente golpeado por la fuerte presencia del paisaje, patrimonio presente en el Perú. Ha visitado Previa, ha visitado Lima, etcétera, que ha decidido separar la conferencia en dos y hacerla más larga, o sea, volver el formato americano en un formato más peruano. I'm talking. Okay. Y entonces va a dar una introducción sobre todo la relación de patrimonio y contemporaneidad, y luego va a ver cómo esto se liga a su obra profesional, ¿no? Y nada más. Entonces los dejo con...
Thank you very much, and thank you all for this very generous invitation. The School of Architects and the Dean, our friends. I'm very delighted to be here. I've been here for 3 or 4 days and seen some amazing things. You have a great country, great challenges, great opportunities, a wonderful place for architects. I'm going to share with you today my work in India with the idea that I hope that some of the things that I talk about will resonate even for you in Latin America and for you in Peru. Because I think architects, all of us, and for me working in India and around the world, are now dealing with a massive set of issues which are cultural, social, economic, and they are changing the built environment in many dramatic ways. And I think we all question our role as architects. What is the agency of design? Because in the process of this rapid change, the role of the professional architect, I think, has been marginalized. Because within the conventional way that we practice, the profession does not engage with the broader environment in which we are situated, but we begin to locate ourselves specifically with a site, and we become very site-specific, and therefore become disconnected with the context of the practice. The word context is very important for all of us, as you know. So our approach of working in Mumbai has been about trying to connect to this broader context and to actually use the city and the broader context as a way to nourish the practice and as a way to connect to this sort of broader context. So I think one of the biggest disruptions that we are all feeling as architects is the disruption of global capital. And I call this the landscape of impatient capital, because capital itself is very impatient. And it creates buildings which are representative of that impatience. And so we look at Shanghai, Dubai, all these places of autocracy, not democracy, which make the arrival of capital frictionless, and they create a particular kind of architecture. And all our cities are being disrupted by this, the shiny, brittle form, which we are rather uncomfortable with. Now, I think then the other problem, I think, for all of us is the creation of binaries. We all create binaries as a way of understanding our context. So we say formal city, informal city. We say rich and poor. We say state and private enterprise. We create a whole set of binaries between the empowered and the marginalized. Now I feel, as for us as architects, as designers, this is totally non-productive. It can make a good discussion, but it's non-productive, because then if we make a binary of the formal and the informal, we have to live in one of those worlds. So we become architects that work with the informal city, or we become architects that work with developers in the formal city for the rich, or we work for the poor, or we work for the marginalized or the disempowered, etc. And so the creation of binaries is highly problematic for all of us as designers today, and I think we should recognize that, because design is about synthesis. Design is about actually dissolving the binaries, about through the creation of space at the level of a site or at the level of the city, dissolving these binaries. And that should be, I think, our ambitious and our bigger challenge. Even between the contemporary and the traditional, conservation or preservation is not just a separate action. It has to be combined with contemporary change. And so I think that becomes a big issue, because I think the idea of fetishizing the local, which is what we end up doing, we create a fetish of the local, it's problematic, because it's an easy way to react to globalization by saying that we want to be very local, and then you fetishize the local culture, the local material, etc., as a way that we feel we are resisting globalization. But I don't think it's true if you set it up as a binary, because the notion that globalization amounts to homogeneity is, I think, a dead concept today in 2015. Maybe in the 1990s and 2000, when the discussion about globalization occurred, of course there was an anxiety that it will create a homogeneity. But I don't think, again, this is very productive for designers. So this is a really confusing condition for us, because we have global capital, which is very disruptive. We cannot over-fetishize the local because it's non-productive. So how do we actually work within this context? And I think for me this is a very important question. But I think to begin with, it's very important to fetishize the local, because by fetishizing the local, we begin to understand the place that we are working in, because architecture is not a movable feast. It's very much linked to climate, to material, to people, to culture. But so we must learn to actually fetishize this in more productive ways, with deeper excavations of the site, not in a superficial way. So of course weather is very important, and climate is what creates culture. This is an image of the monsoon arriving in Mumbai, and the whole mood of the people changes, the culture changes, because suddenly from a hot summer, everything bursts with life, it becomes green, there's water, and of course weather is important. And then we can fetishize it through architecture, and we love doing that. How do you make buildings that will be very enjoyable in the monsoon, not have to react to the monsoon? How do you celebrate water? I think it becomes very important. We have to be careful. What has happened in architecture as a reaction to climate is we are now talking not about weathering, but about weatherproofing. So we are getting obsessed with sealants, double glazing, shiny materials that don't weather. It must always look as fresh as it was on the first day. And so we have changed our brilliant understanding as architects of how materials weather, how they age, like all of us age. And now our discussion is about weatherproofing. How do you make it watertight? How do you make it soundproof? How do you actually cut the weather out? And I think this is highly problematic, because I think you can create a lovely architecture by just letting materials weather. This is a little convention center we've done for 12 people to meet and to meditate, where we use these natural materials as a way that the air can move through it, weather can be perfect. These are platforms for yoga, there are meeting places below, but it lets the stone oxidize and materialize, which is very interesting. You also learn from it for preservation the idea of the life cycle of materials. So in conservation and historic preservation, all the problems are where two materials meet that have a completely different life cycle, because one deteriorates before the other. That essentially is the fundamentals of conservation. But if you can, through design, separate these, so here we made this house where the wall can last for 50 years or 100 years, it's stone from the quarry, which is local, and these come from the city. This is a weekend house, and this has a 15-year life, and a truck can bring the sheets every 15 years and change it. But by design, these two elements are separated. And so I think these ideas of weathering, how we look at material, how we learn from preservation, can inform contemporary design in wonderful ways, and if it's not seen as a separate activity. But if it becomes a separate activity, then you live in the binary and you live in one world or the other world, and it's not about synthesis, which I think is the most challenging aspect of architectural practice. And so we are very interested in conservation. This is a palace in a city called Hyderabad. That's the Char Minar. This was a palace which was owned by the Nizams, who were the richest people in the world in the 1800s, 1700s and 1800s, and it deteriorated completely. We were asked to conserve it, and we only managed to save the core. This was all encroached upon illegally by the informal city, you can say, and so we had to stabilize only the center. But one learns from it. I won't go into the details, but I mean, we found it like this. It was also about mapping. This is wonderful as an exercise. It took us 1 year just to make the drawings, 100 drawings of the complex, but it teaches you about time. It teaches you about the hand meeting the building, about measuring. In today's computer world, these are things that we get detached from. Of course, we mapped it for all the defects, and we began to understand which materials were giving way. But you begin to get into another kind of materiality, which is very important. And you know, that is before and that is after. This column takes us 3 months to make. It's made in lime plaster. The workers and the craftspeople first put lime very roughly, then it becomes hard, then they smoothen it, then they put other layers. So it's layer after layer that takes. So it teaches you about time in wonderful ways, and that's sort of the finished product. That whole ceiling you see is new. Like here, we have also a wonderful tradition of craft, and it's about restoration. We converted it into a low-cost museum. There's no air conditioning, no humidification, no systems of light. It's just for people to enjoy the legacy of the Nizam, and some contemporary interventions very carefully done to protect historic fabrics in this case. This also takes us to more complex problems, and so this is, I think this is a building that you all know. This is not the conventional, this is the Taj Mahal. We were asked to make a conservation plan for it. And we began to look at it very carefully. We began to map it. We found all the components that had problems. This is the complex of the Taj Mahal. You enter there, for some of you who've been there. We identified all the problems. We began the restoration project, so we restored these walls along the river with fine inlay, getting marble from the original quarry. It's all very carefully made. We made beautiful drawings for the craftsmen. But they put our drawings aside and they said the photograph is enough, and they made 100% accurate replicas of what we needed to do just using the photograph. So it also made you understand that in preservation, the protocols are completely different. The same method of instruction that we use for new buildings might not be used for old buildings. And so these are different protocols and different processes which challenge the agency of design in a sense, because we program ourselves to communicate thoughts in some ways. Those were the only instruments they used. They made all this beautiful inlay. This is all this broken inlay. That's the new inlay, which is matched just by using those basic instruments. It's a wonderful learning process. And we started looking at the Taj Mahal from the Google site view, and we noticed this is amazing. The Taj Mahal complex actually goes all the way till there. Most people think this is the Taj Mahal, but this is where the workers live. This is part of the original design. That's why the wall goes all the way. And the wall goes across the river here. There was always a theory there was a black Taj there, but that's not true. What is interesting is this is a Mughal building, which is the Char Bagh, which is the garden divided into 4. And in Mughal architecture, the building always sits in the center. This was the first time the building was moved to one edge of the garden, and no one could understand it. But when they discovered that there was another garden on the other side, then they realized actually the monument is in the center of the garden, which is much bigger. And this was a massive revelation in terms of the perception of the Taj. And there were many rooms here which were not being used. There was a very bad problem with visitors. So we began to interpret these rooms to make them into visitor centers so people could come. There were shops, exhibitions, toilets. Then from there it could go through security and they could go out. And this was the shape of the area when we found it. It had been misused very badly. We were cleaning the black ceilings all by hand. And then we also used, for example, this is the original method of making the lime, because the lime has to be grinded very slowly. And so they use a camel to grind the lime. And it has a very particular consistency because the camel walks very slowly. And so we even got the camel and we did the lime grinding in the absolute original way to understand it. And what is amazing about India is the craftsmen yet exist. And these same people, maybe their great-great-grandfathers had also worked on the Taj Mahal. And they actually could replicate everything for us. And what's interesting, this is the finished product, is for me it was a very big learning process because it confronted me with UNESCO, with World Monument Fund, with many international agencies who said, oh, if it's a broken column, you should leave it. But what does that mean in a tradition where craft is continuous? We have craftsmanship is continuous. These guys, their parents worked on these buildings. That for us to replicate a column and to replace it was very easy to do, and this became a big battle. And it made me think that it's part of globalization. From New York, somebody writes up some codes, or in Washington, and then the whole world follows those same attitudes towards conservation. And I know you deal with the same issues here, and I'll come to that in a second. And it made us really think very hard about it. Now this is a whole lecture, and I don't want to give it, because of my friends who wanted to learn about it, and I met many people who are working with patrimony, I thought I would put it in. So I'll just share with you one or two things which made us rethink the Taj Mahal. So one was, I don't know how many people know, but if you go to the Taj Mahal on a Friday, it's closed because it is a living mosque. The Muslims who live in Agra, which is about 2 million Muslims, come here to pray on every Friday for the mosque. So tourists can't go into the thing. It's a live monument. These are Muslims praying at the Taj Mahal. They've been doing it for 500 years, since 1634 or whatever, when it was finished. But also, what's very interesting is you have busloads of Hindu pilgrims who come here, because there's a sacred Hindu place which is very near Agra. And they come in busloads, and these are Hindus, they have nothing to do with Islam. But when they go to the monument and they go to the tomb of Shah Jahan and his wife, they make a gesture of reverence. They put their hand on the tomb and they put their hand on their head. It's like a sacred moment. Suddenly, it transcends any religion. And so, it made me think, I mean, who does this belong to? The Muslims, the Hindus, the Indians, the world? Of course the world. And therefore it needs multiple narratives to explain it. But all the principles that we use, all the rules that we use that come from UNESCO and from other places, is all oriented to the foreign tourist, to what I call the aesthetic tourist, or the aesthetic visitor, who's only interested in the body and in aesthetics. So it becomes this. And so this becomes the understanding of the monument. And so even today with selfies and things, the body, your body becomes more important than the monument. And it becomes an aesthetic experience that you want to load up on Facebook. And these narratives determine how we preserve these monuments, where visitors go, what stories are told, because it's tourism. Now this is a problem, and I know you have this in Peru, because in the last 4 days, everywhere I'm hearing stories that are beautiful, but what I'm seeing on the ground is some other kind of narrative. And that's very important. Now, if you look at the statistic, the aesthetic tourist is actually very small, 0.3 million. The Indian tourists, who are Muslims and Hindus, are actually much more. So for whom should you be telling the stories? So we began to look at this idea, and we found that every stone on the Taj Mahal has the signature of the man who was the worker, the craftsman. And the master craftsman who supervised 20 maybe workers, he could actually put his name there. So if you walk around the Taj Mahal, I mean, now I've gone there sometimes, not looking at the monument, only looking at the stones and the signatures. And this is a whole story, because this is the people who made the Taj, and these were all Hindu workers. They were not Muslims, because they were like slaves to the Islamic masters. And so this is an amazing narrative. And these are people who even today work there. So the connection with that tradition is absolutely amazing. And of course, this had some meaning. It was also part of an accounting system, like you have these beautiful systems here with a knot that the native people wore. So this is all part of it. And then this is supposed to be the man who's the architect. He is a man called Lahori. He came from Lahore, which is in Pakistan, who is supposed to be the master craftsman for the Taj. So we felt that these are the stories we should tell, because it makes local people engage with this quite differently. So, you know, this is all about making, you can take the context, you can take the local, within the dictates of preservation, but you can excavate these stories more deeply, because the excavation is beyond climate, beyond material, it's also society. Another example, the garden. This is the garden here, where you have actually an octagonal pond here, where the emperor, it's called the moonlit garden. So the emperor, this was a private garden for the emperor, but on a full moon night, the emperor used to go and sit here, and he used to see the reflection of the Taj Mahal in that pond. And poetry was generated because of that, because he saw a dark, murky image of the Taj. And that's how people started imagining the black Taj, but that was never true. But what's even more amazing, and we started looking at old maps, and this is a map that was made just after the Taj Mahal was built. And you realize that, see, the Taj Mahal is folded away from the river, and that is the other garden. Which means this was not even the entrance to the Taj Mahal. The emperor used to come by boat and get into the Taj Mahal from the river. that is a completely different perception of the Taj Mahal than we see it. So what story are we telling people? It's a complete false story, and it's a narrative that disconnects people because it's only the aesthetic tourist who can stand at the distance to hold the Taj for that Facebook image. And so what was even more interesting was, this is the Taj Mahal. We found that there were 40 gardens like the Taj Mahal, which were tombs, which different members of the noble people of the emperor used. So this was a riverfront of gardens, and scholars have actually recreated who owned which garden. But of course the emperor owned the biggest garden, which was over here, like a gateway to that end. Now this is a completely different narrative. And if by telling this story, and we did a studio at the GSD to now make a book to actually put this out in terms of how can one expand one's vision of the thing. And so here you see how the river then becomes central, it becomes the point of entrance. But that is not enough. You see here, this was before the excavations were done. This is a picture from 1930, where no one knew, they just thought there were fields over here in the river, and people always entered from there. And then scholars like Percy Brown made drawings like this showing the Black Taj. He was an English scholar, and he wrote a book, and he made this drawing, so everybody thought there was a Black Taj. So the British established the truth for us in terms of our narrative for the Taj, and this is what we were sort of challenging. And this is a view from that garden. This is the octagonal pond. They started excavating it, where he would see the reflection of the Taj Mahal on a moonlit garden. And so it becomes a completely different story. But I can even tell you one last story which challenges these narratives. This is the Taj Mahal, this is the garden we all come into, whoever's been there, and from here you see the Taj Mahal. And we think this is a monument of love, it's so beautiful. That itself is a false story, because he was actually building this for himself as the emperor of the world, almost to challenge God in Paradise Garden. But I don't want to get into that, that will really take this lecture into 3 hours. But this is where you enter, this is what you see. Now what is amazing is we have all understood the Taj Mahal like this. But this garden was created by Lord Curzon, who was a governor in England. He created this at the turn of the 1900s, so like 1902 or 1903, because the original garden of the Taj Mahal was like this. It was an orchard with fruit, with flowers, where the emperor would walk. It was supposed to symbolize the garden of eternal bloom, because he was supposed to be in paradise. And the Taj Mahal was supposed to be seen as an object floating in the garden, because he was supposed to be in heaven. And there are paintings which capture this. If you look at miniature paintings, you were never supposed to see the base, because that's why it's white and it's taut. It's supposed to be this model of heaven which is floating in the paradise garden. And you were supposed to come in to experience it. And the emperor would smell the fruit and the flowers as he would come into this garden, which was his idea, his surrogate reality of being in heaven. And there are many documents of this. And you can even now, if you go to some corners, you can get that effect of the Taj. So it is supposed to be, this is a photograph a photographer took, but you see it in mist. It's supposed to float in the paradise garden. It's not supposed to touch the ground. But the garden, by making that garden, which the British did, it became a one-liner. You saw the full Taj, you took a picture, and you went home, and you showed it to your girlfriend or wife and said, "Monument of love, I believe in you, honey," and all that. And so what we did was we recreated this with a paleobotanist, and we recreated the logic of the garden. And we found that the trees that were strong were at the end, the trees that needed water, the fruit trees were here. There was a nursery here, so the emperor would say in a particular season he wanted mango trees, so they would take out mango trees and bring it into the garden so he could smell the mango. So it was a dynamic garden which we could find out from the paleobotany. Now, what does one learn from this? And I think what one learns from this is that we need a deeper excavation. I like this slide very much because it puts we said this is incomparable heritage. The Valley of Flowers, like you have in Peru, the Taj Mahal and the tiger. And what is important about all of this is they need a whole ecology to survive. They cannot survive as separate monuments. You cannot look at these as separate monuments. You have to see them as a part of a network, a society, a cultural landscape for them to survive. And the Taj will always have changing meaning. It is a complicated monument. This is an artist called Atul Dodia who shows the tension in these couples in front of the Taj. And I don't know what the solution is. The government did not even accept our proposal for the garden. They began to laugh at it. They said, where will the tourists go? So these perceptions are hard to break, and you have the same problem here in Peru. Going around here, I was totally moved by what I saw. I mean, these Vakas bed, which is a minimal amount of carving in stone, where you have a natural landscape where you have an amazing dialogue between the natural landscape and man's touch on it. Maybe it was functional, maybe people sat while they were looking at the agriculture, maybe they meditated, but they only carved it to the extent they needed. This is man and nature in dialogue. It's profound, it's incredibly deep. The geometries of these things are complex. I was told this was a laboratory where agriculture and plants were used. Now it's prohibited to plant there. This is the same story as the Taj Mahal garden. I mean, why cannot it be dynamic? It's an interesting question for all of you here. How do you make the narrative? The incredible engineering, but one also saw in some parts by accident some planting. We were amazed. We said, imagine if these were full of fields, what harm would it do to the archaeology? These are living places. They could easily become living places. I know I don't know enough about Peru. It's politically complex and all of that. But we share these same problems. And I think it is about a deeper excavation, about creating the right stories that can make it happen. You also have aesthetic tourists here in Peru. They also engage with the monument in a particular way, with the body in the center. But I was amazed by the school children who were Peruvian, who came in hordes, but they were playing around in these caves and the wacas and things like that. I said, my God, if we could tell them the stories that Jean-Pierre was telling me, it would be amazing. They would have a completely different relationship with these monuments as they grow up as generations. So it is about constructing these narratives. How do you tell these stories? What do we as a society feel are important stories? And I think for me, what struck me immensely was this amazing balance between man-made interventions and nature in a very difficult topography, but in a productive way. These are landscapes that were productive. Culture is something we construct. Culture and identity we don't find. That is a big mistake. Construction of culture is our responsibility, and we do it through architecture because we understand what society wants as its aspiration. And so, I think the point I'm trying to make when we are trying to fetishize the context is how deep should we fetishize it? And I think the deeper we fetishize it, the more productive it will be. The less, if you say climate, materials, site, conditions, something, that's fine. What does society mean? What does cultural aspirations mean? What is a broader ecology within which the site sits? That's all local, but it's a much more complex reading of the locality of the context. And that becomes really interesting. And so for us, learning from these kinds of narrative constructions, we also use this for contemporary architecture. We do a lot of buildings with handmade. We have craftsmen who work with us. We of course respond to the climate in very simple ways, technologies, local materials. We, like many of you here, young architects start with, this is Mumbai, and people build weekend houses for holidays here. So that's how we start. This is the kind of houses that get built there. I met this contractor once and I asked him who is the architect of this house, and he said, no, I designed it. I said, you didn't have an architect, you designed it? He said, yes, the client gave me a photograph, a postcard of the White House in Washington, and they said copy it, so I copied it. And so this becomes the expression of wealth, of status. We take these images from elsewhere, and it's simple to do. Now, this is an important diagram. This is the Palladian villa, where you have a site, and in the site is a house. And you have the symmetry on all four sides, which is what this is, where it's the autonomous object. And the ostentation of the house, which is the wealth of the person living in the house, is always expressed on the outside with symmetrical villas. And these are the Palladian villas, the great villas. They're beautiful villas. In our traditions, and I think this is true even for the colonial architecture in Peru, the courtyard is where the ostentation is. The richness of the house is expressed internally, introvertedly. The outside is a response. There are subtle references to status, but the outside is part of a fabric. It is part of a collective being on a street, and your historic center here has wonderful examples of that. And so how do we challenge these? Because this comes to us also from the colonials. But this is our tradition. How do we meet it halfway? We can't just go back to copying tradition again, but how do we meet it halfway? So this is a house we did for a young couple. They wanted to build a weekend house. When the rich people from the city build a weekend house, there's always a tension with the poorer people in the rural areas who work in the house as staff, as maids, as gardeners. They look after the house, exactly what you have even here in Latin America. So what we managed to convince the client is, this is the living room of the house. We said, let's make that a gesture that you give to the locality. And so they have loose furniture. I realized in talking to them that they would go for maybe 5 weekends, maybe 20 days in the year they would go for the weekend there with their children and things. Otherwise they'll be living in the city. So we said that if you make a living room here where the furniture can go inside, and while you're away, the caretaker of the house, the maid, the man who cooks for you, they can use it and with their family and sit there and teach their children classes. There's a water tap there, the water is collected from the roof. So it becomes a gesture to the locality. It also creates security, but it also makes a generous gesture. And today I was discussing with my colleagues here, you know, we have to deal with equity in all our societies. There's a lot of unevenness between the rich and the poor. But also the gesture of equity is the first step. That even if we create a gesture, an illusion of equity, that people can access things, it's a good starting point in architecture. And I think that becomes important. Which is not to say you compromise the architecture. We worked very hard on the plan. There are beautiful light positions. There's courtyards. You can control the light. This is the living room. When they go away, the local people use it. And it's crafted in that way. In another example, which is on a plantation, this is a very big orchard outside Ahmedabad. Now in an orchard in the colonial paradigm, this is where the master's house will be, the person who owns it. And we all do it like that. So the master's house is near the entrance and then you go into the orchard. But here we decided to put the house in the center of the orchard so that the workers who work in the orchard can also appropriate the house. And we did this by actually, this is a lap pool, these are 2 rooms, guest rooms, master bedroom, kitchen. There are doors that come into the courtyard. So when these people are here, they swim, they enjoy themselves in the courtyard, they barbecue. When they go away, they close this part, and then the workers can go into the courtyard to wash the fruit, to dry the fruit out, and they appropriate that space as a double coding in terms of this social kind of agenda. And that's what it sort of feels like. It's like an oasis because it's a very hot climate, hot and dry climate. This is another one where we put this as a pavilion. In the colonial paradigm, you always have a privacy gradient. So the public comes to the veranda or the first portico. Then people, if you know them a little better, they come into the portico. Family members go into the bedroom. So you create a social hierarchy by the way you organize space. Here what we did is you come into the entrance, into the center courtyard, and it's in the middle of the house. So even the workers on the farm, for example, when they come to deal with the owners, they're almost on equal terms. It's not a socially segregated space. So the owners sleep there, they eat there in the courtyard, but the workers can also come in there, and you have privacy. So I believe that architecture has the power to. And of course there are also questions of, like I told you, materials and things like that. This is the courtyard that you come into. So architecture, I believe, has the power to create these gestures, these illusions, and to create equity in other ways if we can recognize this. This becomes very important. This is a house on a tea farm, and instead of cutting the tea, we put the house on one edge. We cut only the tea that we needed for the road. It's a very simple diagram with 3 bedrooms that are these boxes and a big veranda with a sunken sitting. It's made out of lots of local materials, very well handcrafted. But when the worker picks the tea leaves, she can actually make eye contact with the owners when they're sitting and having tea, which otherwise in a lot of ways we organize space that doesn't happen because you create privacy as a way of excluding people. And I think this is a big challenge for society. I'm not saying architects have the solution, but I think we can contribute in the way we can organize space. And of course architecture is about atmosphere. There's beautiful mist here that goes through the house and you can enjoy the view. So it's not about compromising architectural qualities, but it's becoming more ambitious, I think, about our own agenda. And this last one, which is for a doctor next to a village, it's a house which this doctor wanted, where he wanted a master bedroom, living room, swimming pool, all of this. And when you have, in the rural areas, you have people working in the farm, and some people are swimming and sitting under beach umbrellas like they're in California. You begin to start getting amazing tensions in society because of this inequity. But we also brought our own agenda to it. We said this should be a house that can grow incrementally. So imagine if this doctor did not have the money and this was a middle class person, they could maybe make one living room, dining room and kitchen, and when they had more money they could make a guest room. They had more money, they could make some more bedrooms, they could add a swimming pool. So how do you deconstruct the villa into these components that not only sit better in the landscape, but they begin to become incremental in terms of incomes. I just saw Previ this morning, which was an amazing example in this kind of sensibility, which we have now lost for many, many reasons. So that's what it sort of feels like. It's very fractured and fragmented. It's not one big villa. It has a world that is inside. It's not showing off from the village. You can actually see the house. It has a scale. As you walk through the house, you go through a series of courtyards, very simple materials. The swimming pool is very discreet. When people swim, you can see the green, but the workers can see something happening, so it's not totally private, but it's not exposed so that two societies don't clash. You walk through the house and there are many, many sequences. This is the master bedroom, which can become one big room, or you can slide the blinds and it can become 3 small rooms. So it had a lot of ambiguity between the inside and the outside. So just to conclude this one section, I think the local, fetishizing the local is important, but how we fetishize the local to make it productive is even more important. In the way we can excavate the layers of these narratives, of these stories, of social, cultural, questions of identity construction, political, this becomes very, very important. But I think it's not enough fetishizing the local, because I think the productive thing is how the differences between different localities is networked globally. And you know, for me, Alvar Aalto is a fantastic example of this, where he took modernism, he made it so regional. We called him a regionalist at some point during architectural criticism. But he took modernism and made an interface between modernism and nature, through the organic forms, through the way nature came in there, the way he was inspired, the materials he used. It was an extension of modernism. Now this was very local, but it resonated globally, because the idea that nature and architecture should be together was a very powerful one, which modernism had forgotten about in some ways. So these are what I call meta-narratives. So the context is important, but I think as architects today, we should be talking about the context of the context. So every context, however deeply you excavate it, also has a bigger context it sits in, which is the global context, which is planet Earth, which is global forces, capital, political change, etc. How do we make these two intersect? And I think that is the exciting thing about architecture. And you know, like in India, I think it's probably true here, when we've liberalized our economy, there have been a lot of contradictions that have come across. Now what is interesting is that our government, I'm sure your government, have given up the responsibility of projecting the idea of India or the idea of Peru through architecture. Today's state-sponsored projects are airports, highways, flyovers, infrastructure. The state, the government, believes in a statistical architecture, GDP. In India, we are paranoid that the GDP of China has gone up 2% higher than ours. So the state is interested now in a statistical architecture, and in architecture not about arrival and perceiving places, but about connecting places. And that's why we're obsessed with airports and the global capital. How can it come more easily here? What is the infrastructure needed for that, etc. And this is a very big difference, because it challenges the agency of architecture fundamentally. Because what capital tends to do is it tends to isolate the context from the context, because it creates gated communities, whether they're vertical or whether they are in the suburbs. Which are self-sufficient. These secede from the state. These are global suburbs, which are anywhere in the world now. And this is one of the big disruptions. Now, in India, I think it's a bit different, because what has happened in India is that global capital doesn't change the environment dramatically. Because of democracy, there's a lot of resistance. So we begin to get a very disruptive environment like this. These are high-rise buildings in concrete. That's the favelas that go all right through the city. They are amazing adjacencies that exist. But from that you get this kind of inequity, which is dramatic. This is the world's biggest house in Mumbai. It's 100,000 square feet for 4 people. This is the smallest form of occupation, which actually happens at the base of the house. So it's a building like that and the people down there. So inequity, the difference between the rich and the poor, is dramatic. It just completely clashes together. And so I think what is productive in all our societies is for us to construct these meta-narratives that help us understand the context. So to construct the context of the context. And what are these kinds of meta-narratives that I would talk about? I think inequity is one. The other interesting one is the idea of simultaneous transitions. So in India, we are coming out of socialism into capitalism, and we all believe we are now a capitalist society. That's untrue. It takes many decades to come out of socialism, and it takes many decades to go into capitalism. And these things happen together. So there's an overlap. And again, that's very confusing for architecture. When you go from one political system to another, when you go for disruptions that you have occurred here because of terrorism and the lack of faith between people, and you go into a free economy which is democratic, it will happen simultaneously. It will take many decades for this to happen in terms of how security is made, how the whole built environment is organized. And this we have to recognize as architects, it's not overnight, it's simultaneous. And we as a generation are going to work in these decades where it's going to be simultaneous. Both are going to exist together. What does that mean? Globalization, localization, how do we blur these binaries is our big challenge. Another very interesting meta-narrative, which is true for Latin America but also for India, is in our societies, aesthetic modernity came before social modernity. Because in Europe, the social modernization project led to aesthetic modernity or a particular kind of aesthetics. In our cases, very good, very talented, charismatic architects brought aesthetic modernity. In this case, Nehru as a political figure used modernity as modern aesthetics as a political instrument to remake society. But society wasn't modern, and that's why this collage by David Weil is very interesting, because while you see Corbusier and Nehru having a good chat, and then going for a cup of tea afterwards, you see what is happening in the background here of society that's actually constructing this. So this disjuncture, I think, in our societies is something that's common. And how do we deal with it? What is the agency of design for it? So for me, actually research is very important. These are the books that we've produced as part of the practice. Some are scholarly, some are just studio books at the university, some are just for advocacy to try to save an Art Deco area or to save a building. But just for the young people here, what I'd like to say is this is absolutely part of practice. This is not academics. This is not what happens at the university and you go and do something in practice. That's another binary that you should blur. This should be integral to your practice because it's through this that you can actually construct these meta-narratives. I'm going to spend now 5 or 7 minutes just sort of looking at Mumbai to just share with you the problems in Mumbai and then show you quickly some architectural projects where you can then understand how you think it has affected or not affected what we do. So Mumbai is about negotiating these global and local flows. The global flows don't make it. For me, this diagram is very interesting. This is called the 5 stages of squatting. So this man goes, he starts a little business, then he gets more customers, he makes his shop a little bigger, then this guy's in the 3rd stage of squatting, then he puts 2 legs because he is tired sitting with this on his lap. He has a nice shop, the summer comes, he covers it up, and then everybody gets used to it. The monsoon comes, he makes a bigger room, and then at the end of the year, everybody gets used to him. Nobody objects, it becomes part of the furniture and becomes part of the city. Today I saw in Previ the same thing happen. People encroach in the public space, nobody objects, then it becomes theirs. And the whole place has transformed as a result of this. This is incrementalism. This is how our cities and our architecture is made. Through these, because this is related to our economy, to our own complexities in politics, how do you get sanctions. So it's called the 5 stages of squatting. But it explains a lot of what happens in our cities. Of course, it's related to the security index. This person is least secure. So when the police comes, he can just run with everything. This person is the most secure because he's made friends with the politicians or the local neighborhood people. They depend on him. The police people come there to have tea in the afternoon. So he's part of that landscape. And this is the logic of our city. So what does it mean? In Mumbai, this is an ordinary street. During the festival, we have a fantastic festival called the Ganesh Festival where the elephant god people pray to. And during that festival, they want to make a community center. So they don't build a building, they just do that. That's made out of plaster of Paris and paper. And they make a community hall behind it in the street. And that's the community hall. They have Bollywood films, they have dinner, they have dance, they have community meetings. For 10 days, this is the center of the neighborhood. And after 10 days, it goes back to an ordinary street. It disappears. It can be extended, you can explain this. Maybe it has to do with density. So you see Tokyo, how little green space they have compared to Delhi or New York. Look at Mumbai. That's in scale. Mumbai has no open space. So people have to respond to this quite differently. And if you look at Manhattan and Mumbai, this is Central Park. In Mumbai, it's all fractured. So there's not even a centralized, people have to use space in very innovative ways for different meaning. This idea of double coding, like we were doing in the house, that the living room becomes the local people's living room and the owners go away. This is a continuous phenomena in the city. So this is the cricket fields. We play cricket. I think you must know about cricket. It's we jokingly say that it's an Indian game that the British invented for us. And it's a very popular game. But in the evenings, it becomes a venue for a wedding. And this is the pitch. It's sacred, so nobody touches it. This is the members of the club who take high tea. This is the wedding. The kitchen makes samosas, which go to these people, go there. It's a synergy. And in the morning, it disappears so the cricketers can come and play. So the whole city is very elastic. And so our cities, and I think Lima is like this too, these are elastic conditions. They are about incrementalism. It's about the appropriation, deappropriation, reappropriation of space continuously. But I think the main thing, which I also feel in Lima, I feel very much in Mumbai, is the idea of soft thresholds. The thresholds in our city must be soft, where the transgressions between different groups are possible. That the rich don't cut the poor out, that we don't segregate too much, which happens naturally. But because the way culturally we use our space, we naturally have very soft thresholds. We have people working in our house, we have staff of different communities. There is a transgression that happens culturally. And you might argue for it as a good or a bad thing, but it's an economic reality. How do we make spaces that allow that transgression to happen? In fact, this is the festival, so on the last day, these 300 idols like this are submerged. And over 10,000 small idols at the family level. 6 to 7 million people are part of this ritual through the city for 10 days. It's much bigger than the carnival. And what is interesting in this condition, which I call this the kinetic city. It's not the formal or the informal city, but it's the kinetic city. And in the kinetic city, architecture is not the spectacle of the city. It does not even comprise the main image of the city. Many festivals like this are much more important as popular visual culture. And this immersion, this is made in clay. And when they put the idol in the water, the idol completely dissolves. Immersion of the idol becomes the metaphor for the spectacle of the city, because as the clay idol dissolves in the water, the spectacle comes to a close. There are no static or permanent methods to capture the spectacle in the way architecture captures memory for the city. This is an enacted process, a temporal moment as opposed to buildings that contain memory in a particular way. Here, architecture and the city don't even have the same meaning. Because within what I call the kinetic city, the meanings are not stable. Spaces get consumed, reinterpreted, recycled. Because the kinetic city also recycles the static city of architecture to make this new spectacle. So it's really about blurring binaries. But blurring binaries for conservation and preservation becomes complicated. And so when the creators of an environment and the custodians of the environment are two different cultures, it's very hard to do this, because then you have to again construct new narratives. So we were involved, like your Lima Historic District, we were involved in the Historic District, and in 1995, this is one of the first projects I did. We managed to get the government to declare this a conservation zone. This was the first legislation in India for urban conservation, like you have in the core here. So it was very, very important. But I found after we got the legislation, nothing was happening on the ground, because people didn't know what does it mean to have a conservation zone? What does legislation mean? And then I realized that preservationists and conservationists, they live in the postcard city. This is the postcard view of Mumbai. The real view of the same space is this. It's a mess. But the postcard view, this imagined golden era that's better than what we have today, is the narratives that preservationists and conservationists make, because they feel that they can appeal to people's emotions by making this nostalgic kind of narrative. But it's not very productive, because that's the reality. And so this is what the historic district looks like, except for two buildings. This is the Reserve Bank of India, and this is the Taj Mahal Hotel. This is the old hotel where the terrorist attacks happened. The rest of it, luckily, is kept very low. But now, of course, nothing is allowed to go high because of the conservation rules. And then we found that nothing was happening. So we asked ourselves the question, how do we give this personality? How do we construct new narratives? We can't use the narratives the British use. I can't go and convince a group of people that Queen Victoria came to this building, so let's preserve it. In Britain, that everyone will get very excited about that. And they'll do many things to save that building because she stepped on a step there. But in India, that doesn't mean anything. They say, who Queen Victoria? And so we began to then look and ask the question, what are the contemporary engines that will drive the process of conservation today? Who are the people there who have aspirations? And we began to do other surveys. And we found that historically and over time, over the last 50, 60 years, all the major banks of India had their headquarters here. 34 banks had their headquarters here. This got revealed by doing the mapping. We found that there were many galleries and museums here. We found all the tourist activities were here. We found there's a lot of shopping here. We found the corporates here. We found the civic buildings here. So we started making associations as activists. We took 5 years of just every day getting people together. We formed associations. We started working from bottom up before we came to a master plan, and we began to organize associations. Now, this was really about constructing a new significance, because usually how we approach conservation is we find out what is the significance of the place, and then how do we reinforce that significance. Here we said, let's construct a new significance. So I'll show you only one because there's no time. This is the art district. This was never an art district, but because the galleries were there, we met them, and they said, yes, we would like to preserve the buildings because it's good for our business. And by organizing, now it's very difficult for an architect because you're actually walking the line like an acrobat, because you can change the significance, but you have to keep the illusion of architecture intact. This is a very, very tough job, but it then becomes sustainable because people have new meaning for the place. It becomes a new meta-narrative for the place. So this was what was historically never an art district. We began to designate what would be the art district, identified the galleries. This is the big Prince of Wales Museum, which is an amazing space. We began to, call it an art district. We went to corporates and got sponsorship and put maps, calling it an art district. So in 2-3 years, everyone started calling it an art district, although historically it wasn't one. We put signage, we put street furniture, things that the government doesn't do. We put signage. We started getting, for $100 US dollars, we whitewashed this building with lime, and it became very fresh, and everybody said, this association is very good, they're doing good work, let's support them. So we began to use strategies like that. And this is a plaza which became a parking lot. We began to organize a festival every year, which is an art festival. Now it's in the 14th year. We began to light buildings up, and in the public space, we began to organize conferences. And we were doing this. So this was outside architecture and design. This was sheer activism. And it was all in the public space, because we said even the taxi driver should be able to come and stop and enjoy the music. So nothing was in the private galleries. And then we began to take spaces for children and animated. We asked the owners of the building to make the facades of the building art galleries. On the street we put up galleries. We got a famous Indian painter, Hussain, to paint, and that was sold in an auction. And from that money, this parking lot, we remade it into a plaza so activities could happen there. Grade 1 buildings got restored, all from the money we raised through the festival and organizing these activities by constructing a new significance. So it was about keeping the architectural illusion intact, but using a different method of significance. And of course, the Prince of Wales Museum is very major, so we then started working with them because they can contribute a lot of space. We found in the museum a warehouse which was not being used, and it had no windows, it was just a box. And we came up with an idea where in that box we added a veranda so that you could have circulation through the building, and one light well which was there for air, we made it into an atrium for circulation. So we got 50,000 square feet of gallery space in the area by just excavating this sort of space that wasn't used. So suddenly the dimension of the art area and the zone, the cultural district, became massive. And of course we added this new intervention, which we did in metal using some of the stone that came out of the windows. But we did it as a way that it was reversible, so that another generation, if they did not agree with this, they could actually dismantle it and it did not hurt the fabric of the building. So it was a contemporary intervention for a particular purpose, but separated from the old building. And then we made a master plan for them. Then we began to do a series of buildings. We are now doing a children's center there. We made a visitor center here because it's like a threshold to the gallery, because this museum has a lot of security, but we felt if there was a building here which could interface with the art district, then the museum can become part of the art district. So we did a visitor center, which is in stainless steel. It's a grade 1 building, but we said it must be a contemporary intervention, again reversible. So if another generation doesn't like it and prefers making it in stone, they can just, with the screws, remove it and take it away. And it's around these beautiful trees, so we incorporated there. You put your bags there, so it's very discreet. It's detailed in a way that it can be dismantled and it reflects these things. It becomes a gateway to the museum. So I mean, the point here is in Mumbai, in engaging like this with the city, it also extended itself into new architecture, because architecture can play a big role. So once we understood the significance of the new district and the potential of the new district, then the pieces of architecture could facilitate a bigger idea. So it wasn't the context of the site of the museum, but how that piece of architecture can begin to connect to the wider sort of display. Just to spend 2-3 minutes on this, this is India, 7 mega cities, 28 tier 2 cities, about 1 million, 1.4 million people live in these 28 cities. But we have 400 cities that are 100,000 people, which will become 1 million people in just 20 years. So 400 million Indians are going to live in cities that, you know, nobody knows anything about, because all the architects in the country are located in these. In these, you don't find an architect, you don't find a planner. It's an amazing condition, and China is also waking up to this, because now China is focusing on its smaller towns for the same reasons. They have mayors, they're building big infrastructure. The difference between China and India is China is building all those cities in the same character, with the same architecture, and India has a much more complex problem as a democracy. The reason I put this is because it has a big impact on the way we practice as architects, and I think it also has relevance for you here in Peru. So this is historically India: Chandigarh, Delhi, Ahmedabad, Mumbai, Goa, Pondicherry. This is where all the patronage was. The money was here, the corporations were here, the government was building here, modernism was here, all the great Indian architects built here. Corbusier built here, Charles Correa built here, Toshi built here, Raj Rewal built here, they all built here. Modernism had certain protocols. We learned how to design, we made models, we made working drawings, we made tenders, we issued these, and this is the spine of awareness. All was concentrated here because the economy was concentrated here. In the new economy is here, which has completely different protocols, it has different religions, it has different beliefs, it has different interests in aesthetics, it has different ways of communicating things, it has different languages. And by doing preservation, one realized that in different models of engagement, the protocols are quite different in the way you communicate and engage, not only with contractors but with clients. So what is going to be challenging is that as these small towns sit, the protocols here are going to be very different from the protocols here. And so I tell my young architecture friends and students that we have to find innovative ways that we engage. Sometimes we can engage without making drawings in another way, like we do with preservation, for example. We have to find other protocols, because we spend too much time on the practice of architecture. We must, as a group, as a university, globally, we should think about the architecture of practice. What is the different structure of practice that is relevant for a different context? Because we apply the same architecture of practice wherever we practice. That's why if I go into an architect's office in Peru, it's all very familiar in the way I see the models, the drawings, the way they're making the moves, the concept diagram. The protocols are the same. If we have to do the conservation of all this wonderful archaeology in Peru, is that the protocol we should be doing? Maybe that's the problem. We need to engage with people in a completely different way to revive things, to rebuild these things. And I think this is a big challenge for your generation of students here, that when you practice, you'll be practicing around the world. You won't be practicing only in Peru. I hope so. That's the way the world is going. You have to be very aware that these protocols can be completely different and much more productive if you can recognize and read the context well and the context of the context and excavate this very deeply, and it can become very productive. I love this image. It's my carpenter's box, and I like the idea that Castrol heavy duty oil sits with all the gods in the same box. You know, and this is what the world is going to be about. I'm going to now do the last section of the lecture. Let me see how. Okay, is that okay? Yeah, okay. Maybe I take the jacket off. Thank you all for your attention. I really appreciate it. Okay, so this is now architecture, so we'll all enjoy it much more. I'm sorry for all these big thoughts. So I've divided these projects. These are 6 projects, and I've divided them in 2 categories because I think those categories work for us, all of us. One is called localizing global programs, and the other is called globalizing local programs. Now, what do I mean by this? Global programs are programs like software companies, corporate offices. These are not in our tradition. These are things that have happened with internationalism, with globalization. We don't have a precedent. So when we look in our culture, I mean, how do we do a corporate office? How do we do an IT center? So we have to then grab global images. And maybe that's a productive thing, but it's a challenge. Now, impatient capital. Today, if a big corporation, if let's say Xerox or HP or IBM has to move out of Lima, it just means 3 executives with their Macintosh computers getting on 747 and the whole company is moved. It's virtual. So global capital for all of us through architecture is very important that we localize it. We get them to invest in a place, to put their roots down. And architecture can help do that in the way it's configured, in the way it's made. On the other end, local programs, when we are designing a museum for native people or we are doing an orphanage for kids in the favela, clients often tell us, oh, make it in the vernacular, make it like a rural Indian village because these kids will be happy in a village environment. We make a caricature, like a cartoon of the local. And this becomes a problem. I'm not saying we do it as architects, but I'm just saying we must resist that. And I think the good architecture is the architecture that resists the cartoon of the local. And I think that can only happen with an understanding of the local. So the first 3 projects are about localizing global and globalizing local in the landscape. So this was our first project in '94, long ago. And it was for India's biggest machine tool company, Lakshmi Machine Works. And they wanted a corporate office because India was globalizing and they said, now our foreign visitors will come, we need to. And so the clients were young, and this was in Coimbatore in South India, where the beliefs on many things are very different. And this is the diagram they gave us. They said, 7-story building, we have an Australian partner who's going to bring the curtain glazing. It will come in 3 months. We can have it up. It should be a shining building. In the back you put about 40 cars, because we'll all have cars. In the front put a garden. If you can put a fountain, we'll be very happy. And that was the brief. And we thought, my God, our first project, what a disaster. And it was really sort of depressing. And we of course talked to them and understood their aspirations. We were patient. And we came up with a building which is exactly the opposite of that on this side, which is all low-rise buildings. And basically what we managed to convince them, not in so many words, is as India opens out to the world, in fact, let's be confident about our culture and history and invent something from that. And we actually went to one extreme and almost not made a cartoon, but we used the traditional ways of that area very much, because there were no glass buildings, nothing. It's a small town called Coimbatore in South India. You might not have even heard of it. It's among the 28 cities that I showed you in the second tier. And so we came up with a building which is essentially 3 courtyards. And it's used to ventilate the building. This is in the rain shadow, so it's very dry. So by creating humidity in the building, we get a difference of about 7 degrees centigrade. It's a big roof with many manipulations of spaces within it, and then you enter it through a series of courtyards. From the street, you can stand here, an ordinary person can stand here and they can see right through the building. So the privacy is this, it is security, but the privacy visually is dissolved completely. You can see right through the building. And then as you go into this courtyard and into the next courtyard, the second courtyard has water which cools the building. These are verandas where people can have meetings. There are 7 different offices within this, all have natural ventilation, and people can sit and you hear the sound of water going through the building. And every courtyard has a lot of green, so through the telescopic feeling, visually it all collapses, so it's a lot of coolness there, but you feel you're very much part of nature. This is a lotus pond in one of the water bodies, this is a garden in the entrance court. As you go through the verandas, this is a sculpture by someone called Rajiv Sethi. But it's also a place you can have a meeting. It becomes a seat, it's like a chaise. You can put your back in that curve, put your legs up. Someone can sit on a chair which is next door here. And you can have a meeting, go back into your office. It's very open, very airy, no air conditioning. And as you go into the building, it becomes much more intimate, where the owners of the family sits in the top. They can look down in the whole building. These are clay tiles which are hand pressed and put on site. We got many artists involved, and this artist who does paintings of animals and figures, he did all the railings in the building, using the figures but casting them in copper. And then you have a narrative and a story right through the building. These are the clay tiles. They're made by, a lot of women are involved in doing this because they cut it and they make the edges okay, then they hand it out and it's put on the roof. It's about 20,000 square feet. We've used a lot of recycled material, which is all local granite, and it's all very handmade. There are many installations. This has 108 goddess Lakshmi, because that's like a sacred thing, and it's in stainless steel because it's a metal fabricating company, but it's like a flag fluttering. It's a traditional flag, but it's done in stainless steel. But the most interesting aspect was making these screens. These are for ventilation that you see. These were made together with Rahul, who is a contemporary artist. It's inspired by the screens of the Mughal architecture, which filter light but allow the air to go through it. And we have many different sort of designs. But what's interesting is this is all scrap material from the factory of the machine tool company. And with the artists, we collected all the scrap material and then made these patterns. And they're 30 or 40 different patterns that are made based on privacy. But the idea that the material that gives the wealth to the company, the workers in the building can touch it and you feel it and you're reminded that it's a machine tool company through this kind of artwork. And there are many different designs which serve a function and they also go up very high. You know, I always get complimented, and I'm sure it must be happening in Peru too. My friends tell me, we are so impressed that you're using tribal art for your inspiration, and then I have to sadly tell them it's scrap metal, and it changes the conversation. The next corporate building is in Hyderabad, which is in the center of India, also very hot and dry. And this is called Cyber City, where all the high-tech people are. These are all glass boxes, except this is by Mario Botta, so it's in brick. It's the only one that is not in glass. All these are in glass. And we had a client who wanted, they were young clients, it's an infrastructure company. They have trucks that are all over India that make highways. They have cameras on all the trucks. They watch the trucks every 15 minutes. It's like NASA's headquarters, you know, watching everything. It's a very high-tech company, and these guys are watching this truck making a highway. This is their control room. And so they wanted a high-tech building because they said we're a high-tech company. And we started looking at Hyderabad, and we found all the global companies, like this is the Mercedes-Benz showroom, they are always glass buildings. Everything is like this. Every time it's a foreign company or a big company, it's a glass box. I'm sure that happens here in Peru too. The shining surfaces are about a new form of commercial purity. I was saying to Jean-Pierre the other day, like temples were shining, they were also supposed to be pure. Today these buildings also convey purity of capital by becoming shining. But Hyderabad has a bad political problem, so every time there's a riot, these buildings people throw stones at. It's a perfect building to break all the glass during a riot. So now when you go to the glass companies to buy the glass, they also show you samples of fishing nets and they make you choose the color so that you can fit the fishing net to save the glass. And they also do the details for you for the fishing nets. So all the glass buildings in Hyderabad have fishing nets, so it's like a new aesthetic. So we thought this is very interesting that global capital, the images that go with global capital are also very powerful. They drive clients, they are about an expression. And how do you actually counter this? So it becomes really problematic. So we were inspired by this little hut that I happened to see in Jaipur. And this is put up by the government every summer. In the summer it becomes 45 degrees centigrade in Jaipur, and water is difficult to get. And to get clean water that you don't get sick is even more difficult. So the government makes about 200 huts like this, and they give you water free. And it's clean, cool water. And basically what happens is that it's a government service, and this guy, you'll see, maybe I'll skip this. So anyway, I'll just tell you what the hut is. A guy comes, he has a kettle, he pours water, people come and drink the water. He comes out and he throws water on this hut, and by throwing the water on the hut, basically what happens is the hut through evaporative cooling stays cool, and inside the hut there are earthen pots of water which through evaporative cooling stay cool. So it's very cool, clean water. There are no cups involved. You put your hand, he pours water, you drink it and you go. It's a government service which is provided free of cost, and it's the simplest form of passive cooling. So we were very inspired by this. And we came up with a building which is 5 stories high, but it has a garden. Now this is not a green wall like we have where you stick green on the wall, but this is like a screen of green which has a misting system that is in the green facade. And the misting cools the plants and humidifies the plants, and the air goes through it and actually cools 5 floors of the building. What's interesting is that every facade is different because we have different plants. It's a spec RCC building with a trellis, and on the trellis grow these plants. and the misting system keeps it cool. We looked at many plants and looked at every facade differently. If you put the scaffolding, it's like if you just grow plants on the scaffolding. That was one way of doing it. But this was very interesting because a client wanted the building in 14 months, but we managed to separate the facade from the building. So we gave them the building in 14 months, they got the cows, they made the building sacred, they started using the building, and then we took 3 years to make and grow the facade in a small factory just outside the city where 15 people or 20 people were employed. The man said, if you give me 2-3 years, I can make a viable business. So it was interesting, we were not planning this, but because we wanted to make a well handcrafted trellis, which could also then be used in other buildings, it allowed that man to actually have a business that came out as a result of our project, which for us was sort of very interesting. I tried this, maybe this media. No, okay, so something wrong. Sorry. Anyway, and so basically this video just shows the making of the trellis. The trellis is pieces that one person can hold and they can fix it. It's all made by hand. The women involved in making it. We did experiments with different alloys so that we got a beautiful texture on the facade. And that's what the facade looks like after it's finished. These are the conference rooms, the green grows, then you cut it back. It becomes a very, very dynamic kind of facade. And what's interesting is that it has a base on which the building sits. So it's really the basic building with a green facade. And you can see the misting here. It has a very fine mist which actually cools the building. Actually, I should try to, if you don't mind, try to find the media. Maybe it'll be too complicated now. So anyway, there's mist that comes out. It's a very fine mist. So the film shows that it becomes like a cloud around the building. So it cools the building as a result of it. And the building itself, you can see the different plants, it stays very cool as a result of that. Within it there are courtyards and skylights that you can go up and all of that. And different spaces, we are now trying to monitor it for the temperature controls. Because this building has a LEED certificate. We don't have a LEED certificate, but look at the glare that comes from that building. It's right next to us. And so this is a huge problem with internationalizing many of these norms like the LEED certificate, etc. This is what the inside looks like. And you see, this is what happens. This is the catwalk, which is a hydroponic tray where there's drip irrigation for the plants. So not much water is used. Now, the workers, the gardeners can all walk here free of the building. Now, what is very interesting, talking about soft thresholds, is in a corporate office, and I'm sure that happens here too. The boss comes in a Mercedes-Benz with tinted glass. They go to their work. The gardeners are working in the garden. Nobody makes eye contact. These are two different parts of society. But here, the gardeners, the 14 gardeners who work in the building, they can go anywhere in the building on their own on this catwalk, which means they can look into the boss's cabin and the boss has to put their blind down if they don't want to see them. So that becomes a tense moment sometimes, but it becomes this gesture again of equity, I believe. And so they can walk around in the building, and this is not a picture we staged, this is somebody from the office took it. This woman wears a beautiful sari because she knows she's going to be visible to the boss who she's walking past. So there's a lot of dignity, I believe, that occurs in this. And a friend of mine told me that, he said, you have truly created green jobs, because he said that the identity of this building, the aesthetic of this building depends on the 14 gardeners who are the lowest paid people, they're the poorest people in the whole corporation. But they become the most important people through the architecture. And so this form of empathy or this illusion or gestures towards equity, even if they're social, I think is a very powerful thing that we can use architecture to instrumentalize. Because architecture can play this role in making space in a way that this is possible. So they really become the heroes of the building, and you can see they work on the 4th floor while meetings are going on, and you have this dissolving, in a sense, of these two binaries that would occur otherwise. And there it sits like a woolly monster with everything sort of around it. This last building, in this case, I show you because it's different. It's the first building that we have done abroad where we've used the same principle. This is in a city called Basel in Switzerland, and this is the Rhine. This is a campus of the pharmaceutical company called Novartis, where they've invited many architects to build. And we got a site right on the Rhine River over there, which is a very important site in their second phase. Many important architects have built there. This is Vittorio Lumpagnani, who is an urban design professor in ETH. He's done the site plan. It's a very severe site plan, very formalistic. He believes in it very strongly, the architecture of the city. and you see the roads and the grid, and they did it very, very carefully, and then they were left with one triangular plot, so they gave it to Frank Gehry to design a building. And the rest is. So this is the campus, and there's the Frank Gehry building. And this is the new phase of the building. There are many architects, Tado Ando, Rafael Moneo, and this is Caesar, Herzog, Muron, many architects. And we got this site, and it was our first building abroad. And I was really, when we were analyzing this, Nandita, my wife, other people in the office, we found there was something very interesting. This is the concept we came up with, which is the laboratories, some areas for the laboratories to enjoy as like a veranda, a courtyard, and offices, and then a basement with all the tech. But what was very interesting is we were surprised that all the architects, the 25 architects who built there based on this site plan, had organized the services in two big cores: elevators, electrical, plumbing, air conditioning in two cores, and then floor by floor put laboratories and offices. And we found this really problematic, and we felt the better thing to do was to disaggregate this because it was much more flexible. You could change things. People would meet much more because then you don't take the same elevator because you're sitting next to it, but you walk across the courtyard, etc. And you know, just in reflection, I realized that the campus is an isolated piece of global space. And people were not challenging the norms because I think capital becomes very overwhelming when it dictates what you need to do. And I found this very surprising, but we nevertheless managed to convince the client that this was better. So this was one big deviation we made from the 20 buildings that were built on the campus, which was interesting. The second thing we realized was, this is what Vittorio Lumpugnani gave us the envelope, and all the architects just did these 5 floors of about 4.8 meters or something like that of space because laboratories need that space. And we also challenged that, and we felt that the offices did not need so much height. The offices needed 2.6 meters, let's say. So for 4 floors of labs or 5 floors of labs, we could get 6 floors of offices or 7 floors of space, which means that we could use the area more efficiently, which means we could create a big courtyard in the center. So that you could get a variation of space, but also as a way that people could meet. Because I found that in a lot of these global programs, when you segregate people because of function, for some stupid reason, you actually isolate people. And this is a real problem. And I think with technology, when we talk to each other by email, face-to-face contact also is very important. So how? By just making these 2 moves. And the third move that we made, which also for me was, maybe because we come from India, you know, when we practice in Peru, India, we work with constraints and we're very efficient on what we use in materials. The other thing I found amazing was that every architect on that campus had used the same facade system on all 4 facades. Whether it was glass, whether it was metal, whether it was stone, it was the same facade treatment on all 4, which I don't know, I think it's a Western approach where you wrap it and it's supposed to be rigor. It comes from the autonomy of the object, as I showed you in the Palladian villa, that the symmetry must be established on the exterior. For us, the establishing of symmetry on the exterior was not important. And I feel this is a really important question for all of us who come from non-Western cultures to think about, because we reinforce the autonomy of the object by wrapping out the same facade on all 4 sides and separating it from its context in a way. So those are the 3 things that we challenged. And the building we came up with like this. So these are the laboratories. This is one of the service cores. This was a green facade where the scientists could go to write and see the plants while they were writing their research. This is a courtyard. This is for visitors. So this courtyard then allows, from every lab you can see 2 or 3 offices, or from every office you can actually make eye contact with 2 different laboratories, so it becomes a social space. The courtyard becomes a place for coffee. There are plants. These are decks where you can meet. This is the office. Those are the labs. So it becomes a really social space right in the center of the building across these levels because you don't segregate them. And then every facade is different. This is facing a park with the laboratories. This is on the Rhine, so you have a view of the river. The facade was done by Gunther Woch, who is a local landscape architect. There are 18 species of plants, so every month different plants will bloom, so the whole facade actually registers the climate and the seasons. This is a building by Marquis, which is in glass, so we have concrete on one side, so it kind of reflects, which is interesting. And this is a thing for visitors to go and see the Rhine, and that becomes the more private work areas. This is the entrance, which is sculptural. You see the laboratories as the visitors come into the building. You go up the stair, and when you land on the top, you see the Rhine River. These are conference rooms in the garden. And these are what a typical laboratory, the veranda, this is the courtyard spaces and the offices. So you see the offices are only 2.6 meters and then these are the labs on the other side. And as you go up, these are social meeting spaces on all levels, and this is of course within the labs, but you always see the garden or you see the Rhine on the other side. Within the laboratory there are meeting places. So it's actually done to create a socialized set of spaces rather than to segregate. So then I do this last part, which is globalizing local programs. So this is a project for Magic Bus, which is an NGO that takes children from the favelas and then takes them to a campus outside Mumbai for recreation, for health, for education. And this was a client who told us we want to make a rural village because these kids should go to the village to be reminded the villages they come from. And I found this was very problematic because these children, well, these families for 3 generations have not gone back to the village. They've been in Mumbai, living in favelas or slums or squatter settlements for 3 generations. So they are actually urban people. So how do you then actually respond to them? So the kind of agenda we made from it, out of idealism but also as a research agenda, was to say that we would use for these buildings only material that we found in the favelas. And the reason for this was that we felt strongly that these children who are 8 years old, 7 years old, 10 years old, maximum 12 years old, the material should be familiar. But the material should be done in such a way that if they are repairing the houses in the favela themselves when they become teenagers, they might have new ideas in the way they can improve the house, the way they can change the architecture of the house, how the same ordinary materials can be used in different ways. So maybe this was an idealistic agenda. Then we came up with this sort of, it was a campus with just pavilions on it, with playgrounds and things. And it's a series of pavilions, very lightly, that sit on this sort of land. But we also began to take the architecture and in Photoshop see what it would look like in a favela. And this is not built, but we were just testing it. And then we began to say that maybe these are typologies. So this is the dormitory for the children. It could be a dormitory and a toilet, but it could also be a community center and a clinic. Or the dining room here, which is the kitchen and the dining space, maybe a community center for women and a public toilet for people in the favelas because there are no toilets here. So we began to develop this as an agenda. It was very simple materials. This is the dining pavilion, very, very simple materials. The luxury for the children, it's very dense because a lot of kids live in these pavilions, but every child has a control of a window, which is a big luxury for a child because in the favelas they can never have light. And so just by providing light, that was enough to change their lives in a way. But also to use the intelligence in the way a favela is made. You know, they make the stone base, and then when they have money in the night before the government people can come, in steel they quickly make the top floor, then they leave it, they cover it. So we were deconstructing a lot of that and using that logic so that we could replicate it in other projects. And this is the entrance building. This is just galvanized metal. This is not stainless steel, but it's used in a way it makes a pavilion so they get a covered terrace. So simple moves. And then we were also putting them in Photoshop to see what it would mean as community centers. And at that time, I met a friend of mine who runs an NGO. And she told me, she's Spark, it's a very important NGO. And she said, you know, I have very good news for you. I'm now going to solve the problem of sanitation because the World Bank has given us money to make 300 toilets in Mumbai. And I said, wow, who are the architects who are working on this? And she said, we asked a lot of young architects to do this, but we had to follow the World Bank specifications, which is concrete and this and that. And they said, no, this is not good enough, we're not going to do it. So now we have some engineers doing it. And I thought, what a problem. I said, look, we'll do it for you. We won't charge you. We'll do it as a free project. And we're so excited about it. And so we got involved in it because sanitation is a big problem in India. And I think this is a problem here too, I'm sure. And 3 billion people are going to live soon in the informal favelas and squatters. For your generation of architects, your biggest clients are going to be what we call now the informal city, because this is where so many people are going to live. How do you engage? What is the agency of design in a condition like this? If you look at the literature from John Turner on from Previ, when Previ was done, and why was Previ done? It was done to react to this problem that migration was going to happen, a lot of poor people are going to come, that's why you're going to have incremental housing. But when we all became nation states in Asia and Latin America, we became democracies, there was a lot of denial. And if you look at the literature, people deny the squatter settlements and favelas because these are new names. We have bigger aspirations. I mean, these don't exist. Then, as nation states got confident and people were elected through democracies, it was eradication. We were removing favelas as a first thing, and we were doing, in some places like in Peru and in Lima, you did Previ. It was a way of saying, okay, we don't want favelas, but we want good social housing. But you were trying to solve the problem. Then when politicians realized that these are the people who give them the votes, they began to tolerate it. And the whole literature is on tolerance. Then it moves to improvement, that how do you upgrade the favelas, how do you put infrastructure? When the Aga Khan Awards gave a prize to the kampung in Indonesia, suddenly improvement became a hot topic if you look at the literature. But I think for us as architects, we should anticipate. And anticipation is a much more complex problem, and we have to anticipate at many different levels, both temporal, meaning in terms of time, but also in terms of scale. So of course, like Previ, like many other projects, we have to look at the metropolitan area. We have to look at how we can use transportation to create affordable housing. How do you make land available with public transportation which is subsidized? Public transportation is a big issue. These are big, big problems. We do them as studios here. I do them as studios at Harvard. And that's one scale. I'm not going to get into that. I think we are all aware of what the role of planning can be and why planning must be a state subject and must not be privatized, because that's how you can create affordable housing. But let's jump to the other scale. This is a picture that, I always describe. I took by accident. It's a lovely picture. There's a cart of some vendor who sells bananas. This is a slum. And this boy, I went home and I downloaded my pictures and I saw this picture and I was really moved, because suddenly the picture started telling me a whole story. And the story the picture told me was this boy with a smile on his face, white shirt, tie, white socks. He's going to school so happy. But he didn't have a bathroom to use. He defecated in the open. He went behind his house near some channel and he defecated. He doesn't have a bathroom to go to. And look at how intact he has. This is a massive problem. In India, it's if you look at the world, open defecation, India is the densest. The maximum amount of open defecation happens in India. This is a massive problem in our society because we don't have the infrastructure. You have a problem of migration, but look at your population. We are 1 billion people. Mumbai is 20 million people. Out of 20 million people, 12 million people live in the slums. They don't have toilets. They open defecation. People defecate in the open. This is a public health problem. And public health is a common denominator. We'll have a disease in India, it will come to Peru as far. This is a global problem. This is a problem that goes beyond my role as an architect in India, but it's a problem for all of us. Our Prime Minister is now promising a toilet for everyone. This is his big goal. And he said, he's made some promises, I won't get into that. But this is the solution that so they're making toilets prefab, putting them in trucks and dropping them outside everybody's door. This is not going to solve the problem. This tells you that design has a big role to play in problems like this, because this is how they're going to solve the problem. And it's not going to solve the problem, because these will never work. If you look at the analysis of Mumbai, these are in hundreds. We started mapping and we found how many less toilets. So wherever you found that the demand was less, meaning this means the rich people were living here because they were having toilets. Wherever you saw this big demand, it meant that's where the favelas were. If you look at the statistics, it's mind-boggling. In Mumbai, according to the UN, there's one toilet for 1,440 people, for one toilet. It's incredible. The NGO told me it's 1:800. They were more conservative. The Bombay Municipal Corporation said it's 1:150. They were, of course, lying. And their target is 1:50. 1:50 toilets means one toilet for 6 families. Which means every morning you'll have to have a lottery to see who can use the toilet. Because how will you think? It's impossible. So it's actually, it's shameful, and I feel ashamed as an Indian even saying that our aspirations are so weak. But I think this is a global problem. It's a problem for the design profession, and we have to address it. We started studying the toilets, and we found that they were broken. Women and children were not using it because the contractors, these are given to contractors who charge you, 30 cents or 5 cents, 10 cents to use it, and to make their profits bigger, they take out the bulbs from the lights, so in the night it's dark, so the women and children don't want to go near it, so they defecate in the open anyway. And anyway, the demand is so big that it doesn't serve anyone's purpose. They'll end up building these blocks, the government builds these. This is what the World Bank project will give you. If they have to just take the specifications of the World Bank, this becomes the toilet. So we worked on it and we came up with a prototype. We made a toilet where we put the men on the bottom, we put the women and the children on the first floor, so that it was much more safe for them. And then we made a big design move, which, I don't know, whether it was right or wrong, but we took the people who clean the toilet, who are the lowest caste people in India, and we gave them a house on the top of the toilet. So they got the penthouse in the slum. And in front of the penthouse, we made a community space where children and women could go to study, for classes. And then from another client who we had done a weekend house for, I got money for solar panels so that we could get it off the grid, so the contractors would not make it unsafe for the women and the children by taking the bulb out. And then we took the same green facade idea and we wrapped it, and we said, what a beautiful thing. This is all the idealism of all of us architects. I said, what a beautiful thing if people could, because everyone in India, they pray in the morning, and for the prayers, they always take a little flower and put it on the idol. And I said, what a wonderful thing if people can go to the toilet and take the flower from the toilet and pray with it. It would completely dissolve. Madness. We are all mad, actually. So that became that, and whatever within the World Bank specs. And then, so this was the first one. This is in Photoshop. This is a favela. We said we'll make the thing, and we started construction with the World Bank money. We made designs for 9 toilets. It came up to about 3 feet from the ground, and the government stopped it. And so I went to the Bombay Municipal Corporation and I said, what's the problem? And they said, no, we had not understood the design, but this is too much of an iconic building. So I said, what do you mean iconic building? They said, no, it looks too good, but because you have given a community space, these people will organize themselves as a community, and we are already talking to a real estate developer who's going to relocate them, and then we are going to give them FAR so they can make residential buildings there, because we have to use the private sector now to help us solve this problem. But if you put such a beautiful toilet here and the people become proud of it, they'll organize, and they won't move here when we want to move them. So here it was architecture working against a societal problem. So it was an interesting contradiction, and I started getting, of course, very impatient. Like capital is impatient, I got impatient. So we went to another site and we designed another smaller toilet, and we said maybe they'll allow this, and the same thing happened. So then we told Spark, the NGO, let's go to some place where there are very bad roads so that the government people won't come and we'll build one. So we did that and we built one, and it got built, solar panels, the community space, the house, and it got built, and it was fantastic. I went there, I took photographs. This is bamboo slats, which I see a lot of here. Their children used it to study, to play. This is the public housing, which nobody moved into because it's so terrible. And so this was a very nice community space, and you can see the textures, the solar panel. Everything for 6 months was fantastic. And then I went back, and then we found that it had been abandoned, and the government had built a typical prototype like they build everywhere else. So it was a complete failure. And of course, there are many obvious reasons. We got caught in this World Bank funded thing with the NGO. We got impatient to build one, so there was no participation. This NGO had no connections in this one society. So it was just so stupid that we got involved in doing this. We were just very impatient to demonstrate that this toilet could work, and it would be very nice. But it was a complete mistake. And it became privatized because we realized that the man who was the contractor to whom the money went was also the local politician, and he got his son to start a company so they could build this, so the money could, I'm sure you're familiar with those kinds of tricks that happen everywhere. And so it was a complete failure, and a failure not so much with design. We worked, I think, quite well within the specifications of the World Bank, but a failure that we did not, what was so obvious, and we've done in so many projects sensitively, that we did not connect to the community there. And we were removed from the NGO, and partly the NGO's fault, because that was the role that they would play. And it became just locked, and only some people could use it. They had a bed and television, there were bottles of rum lying there, so it became like a club. And one looks at Samuel Beckett, who said, ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail again, but fail better. And I think failing better has a lot of value. And I always say at universities when I do this talk, and I say to the deans and the directors that we should organize a conference which has never been done before. You should invite 10 well-known architects from Peru or from abroad and ask them to present one project that they think has failed completely. So it could be a conference on failure, because we don't know how to even explain failure. Most talks we go to, I've gone to talks as a student, we only see these grand successes. Every complex problem seems to succeed in beautiful ways. I mean, of course, photography and Photoshop helps a lot, but I think failure is something we have to learn how to develop a language for it. And we've been trying again. This is an international competition we did for the Gates Foundation. We won the first prize. And we tried to now fit the toilet much more into the community with shops which could sell soap and water and things that are related to sanitation, but then it would dissolve completely, and then of course different materials, because now the World Bank wasn't involved. We also in the site planning said the toilet must come across from the temple, so these become the two sacred areas. And we won the first prize, but it was an academic exercise, and of course nobody is implementing it. We were trying. Our aim was, we said, if the women from the community can come and have a picnic on the terrace of the toilet, then that means it's embedded as a social institution which is clean and sanitary within that community. I will just end the project with a low-cost housing project. I feel embarrassed showing this because I saw Previ today, which is so beautiful, and this is nothing in comparison. But the nice thing about it is that these are my clients. It's for 100 elephants and the people who keep the elephants. And these people are called Mahuts. They are the keepers of the elephants. They are all Muslim. And in India, this is in Rajasthan near Jaipur. It's a very complex problem because that's a Hindu state, right-wing Hindu state. So these people are very poor. They earn 5,000 rupees, which is less than $100 US dollars for their whole family, for the elephant. If it's a good tourist season, maybe they make 10, 15 more dollars. So they are very poor. And this was a low-cost housing project where the government gives only 40 meters per family, 400 square feet, 40 meters per family. So it's very small. But the Mahut is very important because the relationship with that elephant is very complex. Only he can control that elephant, and this takes years to cultivate. Sometimes they inherit it from the family. It's not an easy task. These elephants in this hot climate of Jaipur, which is a desert, goes up to 50 degrees centigrade, they go rogue. Sometimes they attack tourists. And this is because their health is bad and they have no water. They came to Jaipur as an accident because the Mughals brought them there for ceremony. Because these are beings that must be in the tropics. They need a lot of water. And what they do is they basically take the tourists up these ramparts and they get painted. And this discolors their skin completely. It's all white because they can't wash it because there's not enough water. And the government made housing for them like this, which is the elephant here and the Mahut lives on top, like a car garage and the owner. But it doesn't, it's a disaster. So the Mahuts have to live there and sleep with the elephants because they have to sing to the elephants, they have to keep them calm, etc. So some NGOs put pressure on the government and there was a competition, we won the prize. But the reason I think we won the prize is we made it a landscape project. We said that the architecture is not important because unless there's water, what's the point of doing anything for these elephants? And so it was a very difficult project because in a competition to put architecture at the back, it was a big risk. But we felt very committed to take it because we felt if we even won the competition, if we didn't do the landscape, there was no point in winning it. And so this is the site, this is Google Street, Google View, where you see water going. So we came up with the idea where we would have small dams to hold the water, so you would get a series of water bodies, and then in the extra land we would put the housing. That's the site plan with the species. We made a visitor center. These were some broken buildings here. We said we'll convert it into a school. We came up with many very nice strategies for the community because it's 100 elephants and 100 keepers, which means it's about 600 people that would live there. And this is how we got the site in March 2007. That is the same hill. And you see in 3 years, just by holding the little water, there's very little water there, but by holding it, one transformed the whole area. And this is interesting. It's a very interesting lecture in itself. But the reason this happened is the government that made the competition, like in Previ, after we won it and the construction started, the government collapsed. And the new government did not want to have anything to do with the project. So for 3 years, they did not allocate the houses, which means it gave nature 3 years to regenerate itself. And then after 3 years, when the government saw the project and the success of the water, they said, now we want to help finish the project. And so we were lucky politically, because if that 3 years did not happen, then nature would never have, they would have made roads, they would have spent more money, because people would have got kickbacks, it would have become just built up more than you needed to build it up. So it was actually a luck. And now we have enough water for these elephants, for their families. In fact, it's interesting, they have more water than they need. For the housing, this is what the government wanted, row houses, 40 square meters, a house for the elephant on the same level. Of course, we changed that and we made it like this with a courtyard so that the house became 30% bigger. And then for 3 houses, we put a bigger courtyard, so the houses became 60% bigger. So by using the open space, which is a very easy, listen, I have not invented this, many architects have done this, it configured it differently, but it also created a sense of community where the elephants and their keepers could be here. So this is a place for children to play, for the people to sleep, because it's like a big bedroom, because in that climate in the night you can sleep there, you can cook there, you can have friends meeting you there, the house doesn't become so important. And this is how we were imagining it would happen. These roofs would be used for the storage of the food for the elephant, but also insulation. Elephants cannot lie down on flat ground. They have to have a slight slope. They sleep on berms, because if it's flat, they can't get up. So for every elephant, we had to kind of, that's what the site visit used to be, is to make them lie down and see if the slope was enough. It was a lot of fun. And this is what it looked like finished, the first water body. These roofs are designed to keep that hay for the elephants so that it keeps it cool through the insulation. Some trees are beginning to grow. Again, sorry this video won't work, but you know what elephants look like. And this is what the houses are. And it has not yet been owned by people. So it's yet in a clumsy stage, because the present government is a very right-wing government. They have abandoned the project totally in the last 2 years or 2.5 years. So things are a bit messy. But once they allocate these houses, people will paint it. They're beautiful artists in Rajasthan. I mean, this will become a whole different thing. And the one wonderful thing about housing, which I saw today in Previ, is housing has to be malleable. Life has to corrode housing. Housing we cannot be obsessive as architects about. There's some DNA that exists, like in Previ the public spaces are yet intact, but the houses have transformed in dramatically beautiful ways, which is what I hope will happen here. But at least it gives them a habitat. He's coming back after a day of work, his wife is greeting him. Every cluster is finished differently depending on who lives there. And this is the beautiful thing. In Jaipur, the rich people have to buy water in water tankers every day because there's no water. And the poorest people in Jaipur now have more water than they need. So they grow flowers, they sell flowers. Now we did not start out by saying we are going to design it such that the rich will have no water, the poor will have water. This was just an accident where one realized that if you facilitate a different set of values, the effects are quite different. And they can be quite dramatic, because this is also a form that inequity gets corrected by accident, maybe, just through water. The fact that they're empowered through water is amazing. And it's about them creating an armature for life, in a sense. And that's what housing is. It's an armature for life to live in beautiful ways, for communities to form. The architecture must recede. Not that the architecture must be bad, but it can't be the only thing. And now life is beginning to corrode it. People cook outside. You can see the trees are growing. The goats have come. The trees have got bigger, people have dish antennas, the trees, this is like last year, now the trees in 2 monsoons have grown a lot, so the habitat has changed completely. These are many proposals we made to the government to make the water collection efficient. Some things are happening, some things will happen. Recently they made the walls to retain the water so that it doesn't get corroded, because every time an elephant walks, the whole sand comes out. So this stabilizes. The lowest parts of the site where the water collects naturally are like forests. They are very, very dense. And elephants also can't be alone. They love to hang out with their friends. So we had to make these pavilions where, every day they could tie them up with their friends so they could chat and stroke each other and all that. But again, the effect of this was amazing. And the effect of this was that the Mahut's children, who are teenagers, they started a company called Elephantine. And they had a web page, and they were on Facebook. So young tourists like yourselves, who love to put a picture touching an elephant on Facebook, could book, and these guys charge you, and then you can feed the elephant and you make pictures and put it on Facebook, and they charge you like 5 times more, and they'll even take you for a bath with the elephants because there's so much water. So now there's a whole business and an economy that the next generation has started. Again, we did not plan this through design, but the fact that there was water, there was an ecosystem, so a whole ecology develops. And I think this is what I mean by housing is an armature, it's a framework for life to happen. And the more robust you make that framework, the more value you put it in terms of what society needs, in this case just water, all sorts of new chemistries come up which we can't even as architects imagine. But it's getting, I believe it's getting those values right. And now we've also designed this, we've designed many things which were not even part of the project. we're hoping some government will be excited and make it sometime. So this is a visitor center and a small museum, because elephants, when they retire from work, will be here, so then tourists could look at them and play with them, and it's a non-building, you can climb on top of the building and look at people bathing. And this is the buildings that were broken by adding the stone wall and just painting it. Now these children have a school, and there's an NGO that runs the school there. So again, it's about developing this broader ecology where life can exist. And I think for housing, this is a very important thing, that you should let life corrode housing. We cannot be, as architects, obsessive. We must have the right DNA that housing can grow in interesting ways. I'm going to finish in 5 minutes with a conclusion. Just to say that tactics is knowing what to do when there's something to do. Strategy is knowing what to do when there's nothing to do. And how we combine strategy and tactics, we are often obsessed with tactics. But I mean, I think this is where I also mean the context of the context. How do these two things intersect? How does the context of the context intersect with the context, which is the local? That's why fetishizing the local is very important, but it's more productive if it intersects with the broader context. In the same way, the binaries, how do you dissolve them? We can't think of the formal and the informal city. We have to think of the city, and that's the beauty of design and architecture. Similarly, it's tactics and strategy. They're both equally important. We often are only involved with tactics or only with strategy. So how do we combine this? Because I think as the world gets more complex and becomes global, I think we have to be cautious about accepting that things are growing more alike because they're beginning to look more alike. Because when we engage with a deeper excavation of the site, like I was showing you in those conservation projects, the new narratives, then I think a deeper understanding emerges, which draws both on the objective reality, but also on the subjective perceptions, which is our intuition, our reading of culture, of people. It's very important, because once you do that deeper excavation, then actually the differences emerge much more strikingly than before, where differences were actually assured when things look different. So earlier things looked different, we knew this is different from that. Now everything is looking different, everything is looking the same, but actually it's profoundly different, and we have to recognize this. Because otherwise, as architects, we fall into the trap of creating very dangerous polarities in our society. And architecture is a very powerful instrument to separate people. And we have to be careful how we engage with it. And I think this intersection becomes very important. So as architects, we have to find a more rigorous way of defining this complex, emerging cultural fabric of multiple aspirations in all our democracies. And more importantly, to see this cultural fabric as an ever-evolving kind of set of issues and landscape. So culture and identity are not things you go and find. I mean, you all get asked, well, what is an Indian identity, or what is Indian culture? It changes every 24 hours, and we are part of the process of constructing it and constructing the significance. And architecture, preservation, urban design, planning are all critical instruments in constructing this sort of culture, because they're not found categories. Arjun Appudurai, the anthropologist, said culture is a dialogue between aspirations and sedimented traditions. So in these interpretations that we make as designers of a place, of a culture, of a nation, ideas of the future are as important as the ideas that we discover from the past. And how we nurture the future is also very, very important. And I think in the highly pluralistic environments of Latin America, Peru, India, these are highly pluralistic societies. We are dealing with cultures, many cultures, many layers. And I think actually now every geography on planet Earth. So we need planning and design mechanisms and attitudes that continually negotiate between the differences, between architecture as the autonomous object and the temporality of temporary places for celebration, the ephemeral that creates these conditions for celebration and habitation, between the state and the market, between the empowered, the rich and the poor, between oral cultures and literary cultures. How are the protocols different? Some cultures depend on oral histories and oral protocols and communications. Some are very literal. We have to find ways that you make middle ground on all of these, between the static city and the kinetic city. I think design can play a critical role in dissolving these binaries rather than allowing one entity, one of these components, to remake the city in their image. I believe that's the big problem with China, where they've remade the whole country in one image of free floating global capital within an autocracy. Because I think the default condition of these dissolved binaries is what makes, for me, working in Mumbai, working in India, and I'm sure for you working in Peru, very, very exciting and unique. Because I think once the architect sees these various differences, and this is very important, we have to see these various differences as being simultaneously valid. Then the challenge is, how do we go beyond these polarized binaries? How do we deal with different worlds, differing adjacencies? How do we bring different scales together that represent these different worlds? And I think it's in this imagination of the simultaneous validity of dissolved conditions and the validity of these differences, I think we'll really make that space where we will be able to engage with nature, with society, with technology, and finally with architecture much more meaningfully. Thank you very much.
Agradecer al arquitecto Mehrotra, pero él dice que puede contestar algunas preguntas. Así que si hay alguno de ustedes que quiera hacer alguna pregunta respecto a lo que me dice. ¿Ah? Puede ser sí, no necesita ser en inglés. Puede ser en castellano y sí. Se puede hacer las preguntas un poco más informalmente. Bueno, nada, entonces, gracias.